What's up, YouTube? Today I wanted to talk about the figure of Dhul Qarnayn, or which translates as the two-horned one in the Quran. And this is in Surah Al-Kahf, which is chapter 18, verse 83, all the way to 98. And it talks about a figure who travels from the east to the west and finds a people who have no protection from the sun, and he builds, he offers protection to these people, and he builds a barrier that blocks off what's considered Gog and Magog, or kind of a destroying people. And God gives him the ability to raise up whoever he wants or to punish whoever he wants. Um, and also the people that he's protecting, they say, do you want money? What do you want? He says, no, I don't want anything. My reward with God is greater than anything you can offer me. Just offer me assistance. Help me actually build this wall, kind of this iron gate. And what's described, the Quran says that the end of times will be described as this gate falling, and then the people of Gog and Magog, or Yajuj and Majuj, as they say in Arabic, will come through and cause corruption in the land. So the character of who, or the figure of who Dhul Qarnayn is, can be considered, the two-horned one can be considered a bit controversial, because it was, for the most part, considered Alexander the Great. From the earliest times, it was considered Alexander the Great. It's still considered Alexander the Great. Some people now will say Cyrus the Great. But from my perspective, and I think just common sense and understanding what's actually out there, not just viewing the Quran, is looking at all forms of mythology, right? Because mythology doesn't necessarily mean fake, right? You can turn to the Bible, you can turn to the Quran, you can turn to Islamic belief, you can turn to Jewish belief, you can turn to things such as the Alexander Romance, and I'm going to get into that into a second. So I do believe it is Alexander the Great, and I think just common sense and just understanding of literature will show you that way. So to start off with, Alexander the Great, he was depicted on all his coins as having two horns. This was a reference to Zeus and in Greek mythology, as well as to Ammon in Egyptian mythology, and that was associated with a god. Now, one of the things that people believe, and I'm going to link this video that talks more about it, was that Alexander believed in xenophanes. So he didn't believe that the Greek gods were actually gods. He just believed that this is just sort of like an allegory of human character. So he didn't actually believe that. He only believed there was one God, which would align with the Quranic view that Alexander was, monotheistic. And also, you have to understand that he was only exposed to what he was exposed to. Not every character mentioned in the Quran, was a prophet, was a messenger. There's more prophets than messengers. Messengers are literally giving revelation. So you got to understand that not everyone was given the exact same message. Not everyone had contact with Gabriel or the angels. And so, we're seeing the two-horned one quite literally very, it kind of exemplifies Alexander and his coin and his association with Zeus and the god of Ammon, although he may have not actually believed they were gods. And so what we're also going to do is we're going to turn to a historian by the name of Flavius Josephus. Now, the concept of Alexander, traveling to the ends of the world and creating this gate that shuts out the tribe, this was believed before the Quran came about. Now, that doesn't mean that the Quran, people who will be like anti-Muslim or anti-religion, they'll say, oh, well, the Quran, it took from these legends and then it incorporated it as its own. So we're seeing, first, it's Flavius Josephus came up with this. And, in this story, he builds the Caspian Gates, and it's to shut barbarian tribes behind them. So behind the gate in the Caucasus Mountains. And this is 600 years before the Quran. So this is Alexander doing this. So it's later on, this was after Ezekiel came on. Afterwards, people associated this story with Gog and Magog, because Ezekiel talks about Gog and Magog. And, another story is in the book of Daniel. There is a story of a goat with one horn who's represented as Alexander, and he goes against a ram with two horns, which is represented as the Persian Empire, and his horn breaks. The goat rams the ram and ends up winning, and his horn breaks into four separate horns, and those four separate horns are related to Alexander's empire once he passed away, because once Alexander passed away, his empire turned into four. So this is actually a belief that Daniel prophesizes Alexander the Great. And now there's an actual story about this, and it is in the Talmud, and it is believed that Alexander, he had a dream that he saw a rabbi before he got to Jerusalem, which he was planning to conquer it. He had a dream that he saw a rabbi, and so when he gets to Jerusalem, he wasn't coming aggressively. He was just kind of coming, because oftentimes conquerors, if the people say, yeah, you can take over, sure, that's fine, they're not going to kill anybody. And so Alexander, he sees this rabbi that he had in the dream, and the Jews approach him and they say, oh, you're prophesied in the book of Daniel. And so Alexander accepts that Daniel references him. He also accepts the God of Israel. He has debates with the sages to kind of understand this monotheistic religion, because again, not everyone is exposed to monotheistic religion. If someone's in Greece, how are they going to expose to what's happening in Jerusalem, right? The internet didn't exist or anything like that. Okay, so this is a thought that existed before the Quran. The Talmud also talks about the edge of the world, how this conqueror traveled to the edge of the world. It even mentions the sun. He traveled, this figure, Alexander the Great, traveled to where the sun rises directly from the ocean, which sounds exactly like what's said in the Quran. Also in the Talmud, it says dark mountains in the north and encountered savage tribes, and he closed the path with iron gates, which sounds exactly like the passage from the Quran. And again, when it comes to the book of Ezekiel, when it comes to the Syriac Alexander romance, so which is a kind of a mythology about Alexander, when it comes to the Quran, it all aligns with that. Gog and Magog will, eventually destroy these walls, and will be associated with the end of the time. So we're seeing several different, we're seeing the Bible, we're seeing the Quran, as well as what's considered a mythology, the Alexander romance, all talking about how the end of times will happen once Alexander's wall, comes down. Even within Islamic belief, following the Quran, and this is in tafsir as well, it's believed that Alexander enlisted the help of jinn to help him build this wall. There's also within Islamic belief, there's the belief that he met Khadr, the green man, and he helped Alexander find what was called the water of the fountain of life, the water of life. And an interesting fact that Alexander met Dhul Qarnayn, Alexander met Khadr, the green man, is that the verse of Khadr, the green man, is literally right next to the verse where Dhul Qarnayn is mentioned. So they're both in Surah Al-Kahf, and they're relatively close to each other. So, to summarize, basically what I'm trying to say is that I'm going to bring some parallels in. So I'm going to talk about the Great Flood, right? The flood that in the Quran, that's mentioned in the Bible, about Noah constructing a boat, and there was a flood that kind of destroyed the world. When you look at other mythologies, all the way to the Native Americans, when you look at something called the Epic of Gilgamesh, so this is like Mesopotamian mythology, you see the story of the Great Flood, right? And so we call those things mythology, but then what we have to understand is if something actually happened, right? The Quran is talking about events that happened in the past. The Bible is talking about events that happened in the past. Okay, so there are two people who will look at these things and say, oh, well, the Quran and the Bible, it stole from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a major flood. Okay, but the other more probable, understanding is the fact that, well, there was a flood that happened. Okay, and then there was a flood that happened, and so other cultures and people are going to talk about it, right? Right now there's a war between Iran and the United States. Okay, we have all different news outlets talking about it, and it's all slightly different, but it all comes down to the same thing, right? Because it actually happened and people are talking about it. So it's something doesn't become a mythology just because, well, it's not Quran or Bible, so it's fake. So I'm going to draw this parallel over to Alexander the Great. Okay, so you have, before the Quran exists, you have the story of Alexander the Great, traveling to the ends of the world, traveling where the sun comes out of the sea, blocking off these savage people, creating a gate, being a monotheistic believer, traveling to Jerusalem and seeing himself prophesied in the book of Daniel. We're seeing this from Flavius Josephus. We're seeing this from the Alexander Romance, and just thought that was around the Levant at the time. The Mediterranean, the Near East. So where Jerusalem, Syria, Palestine, Israel is located. This was a common belief that Alexander did these things. And then now we have, in Gog and Magog is in Ezekiel and the Bible. And then now we have the Quran come and say, God is telling Muhammad, peace be upon him, saying, there's going to be these rabbis, these Jewish people. In order for them to see your legitimacy, you have to tell them the story about the two-horned one. Okay, so now think about that for a second, because this is in the Quran. This is God trying to make, show Muhammad how to be legitimate to these people, right? So they would have to understand that this was a story that existed, right? But that means if they're understanding that there's this guy who went and did, build this tower, traveled to the ends of the earth, that means it's an existing story within their tribe, within their people, and they're associating him with Alexander the Great. So if Muhammad, peace be upon him, is instructed by God to go to them and talk about the two-horned one, and everything he's saying is aligning to what they already have in their belief system regarding Alexander the Great, then it would only make sense that this is Alexander the Great. Now here's the thing. Well, people say, oh, well, he's a pagan. Oh, well, he was a conqueror. Oh, well, he did bad things. So history is written by winners and history is written by losers. Okay, you got to realize that. When it's written by losers, in a lot of the Zoroastrians and early Persians, they just said this guy was terrible, right? The Greeks just viewed him as someone who was unifying. And then we have the Jews at the time who was viewing him as this monotheistic, prophetic-like figure, right? So history isn't, we can't combine history and religion together, because, if you show history, they'll say, yeah, Muhammad never did this, and Jesus never existed, and Solomon, we have no archaeological evidence that Solomon was here, right? Religion and history, they sort of align, but not really. They can't be what we only value or what we only base off of truth. And that's what too many modern, Islamic people who or Muslim people, they try to say, well, this has to be someone else, it has to be Cyrus the Great, it has to be this, it has to be that. You sort of have to make sense. Why would the Jews be knowing about Cyrus the Great instead of Alexander the Great when they had these stories about Alexander the Great? They didn't have any of these stories about Cyrus the Great doing almost exactly, word for word, what's in the Quran, right? So based upon this, it's kind of like my last video when I talked about the book of Enoch. There's a lot of overlap between what's considered mythology or pseudopography and what's the truth and what's in the Quran. Okay, because if you're watching this video and you believe what's in the Quran, then you have to believe that these stories aren't just mythology, right? Mythology can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't mean something is fake, okay? It's like when in the Quran, when it talks about, and we placed a body on Solomon's throne, that's kind of word for word what it says. People didn't know what that meant when they were reading the Quran. They're like, what is God talking about? We tested him by placing a body on his throne. But then you read the book of Solomon, which came before the Quran, and then you're seeing there's a story within the book of Solomon of a jinn named Asmodeus, and he was able to trick Solomon and go onto his throne, and Solomon was all the way in the Negev desert, and he had to go all the way back and take his throne. It's sort of, we fill in the blanks, right? And it's the same way that, when a lot of people do tafsir or explanation of the Quran, they use, what they know from the Bible or from Judaistic belief, right? Because where did all the prophets come from? Where 99% of them, they all originated in Israel. So, people wanted to get stories from the Israelites, right? It doesn't mean that everything that they say is right. It doesn't mean that everything that they say is wrong either, in the same way that what's Islamic belief, right? Islamic belief is when people branch off of stories that aren't in the Quran, just like Islamic belief and tafsir says Alexander the Great used jinn. We don't know that, right? But this is what is Islamic belief. So, in other words, to shorten everything, the story of Alexander the Great doing what Dhul Qarnayn did in the Quran already existed before the Quran. Okay, the fact that Muhammad was instructed by God to go to the Jews and mention these stories to show his legitimacy means that they already knew that these were real stories and that it was from Alexander the Great, and that, Muhammad was approaching him, possibly saying the two-horned one, but or at least that's what what we're hearing. And I think it'd be very easy for them to associate the two-horned one with Alexander the Great, right? Because Alexander the Great on his coins was associated with two horns. And you can look that up yourself now. So it's an interesting, perspective. It just goes to show that it's kind of basically at the end of the day what my channel is all about. It's everything's interconnected, right? The Bible, the Old Testament, which is the Tanakh, the Jewish text, the New Testament, which is the Gospels, the Quran. These are all just one story. They're all just the religion of God, right? And I have a video on there's only one religion. That doesn't mean that Islam is right and screw everything else. It doesn't mean Christianity is right and screw everything else, or Judaism is right and screw everything else. It means at the end of the day, people need to combine together, because there's one God and there's one message and there's one people, right? Because we all come from Adam and Eve. So we shouldn't be fighting amongst each other. We shouldn't be saying, oh, the Israelites believe this, or the Muslims believe this, or the Christians believe this, and their book is flawed. And even to expand greater, we don't need to necessarily believe that everything that's considered mythology is fake. Okay, so and also, we need to have some discernment when we're learning about history, and we think that just because history doesn't describe Alexander the Great as a monotheistic, that doesn't mean that he wasn't a monotheistic. So thank you for watching, and I hope you learned from this video. Thank you.